Thank you, Simon. As you know, the Book of Revelation is something I've been investigating for a while, particularly the two views of it being either a futuristic reading or something that is historic, talking about first century issues. So my question would be flat out, do you think the Book of Revelation is about the end of the world?
Okay, well, I'm going to give you a kind of a no and a yes answer to this, but let me explain a little bit what I mean. I think if by a question like, is the Book of Revelation about the end of the world, what you mean is it a kind of dummy's guide to the end of the world? Then my answer to that is no, it isn't. I don't think that in the Book of Revelation, you've got a kind of a list of all the things that are specifically and precisely going to happen leading up to a point when the world ends. And I think those who have tried to make it that have often then tried to come up with dates and, you know, fix the date as being something that's going to happen in their lifetime or something like that. And I think, you know, that people have been trying that for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And really, the Book of Revelation has proved no better at helping sort of predict the date of the end of the world than something like Nostradamus. I just don't think it does that. However, so that's kind of my no answer. But I think there may be another way in which the Book of Revelation can indeed speak to us as Christians very powerfully about the end of the world. So I'll give you an example. Have you ever heard someone say, you know, perhaps after a tragic bereavement or a serious illness, you know, it was the end of the world? Mm-hmm. Now, they clearly don't mean that the world has literally just ended. And if you assume that they did, you'd kind of be missing their point. What they mean is that the world as they knew it has gone. And they're now living in a new world, a world that is in a very real sense different to the world they were living in before. And of course, you know, such world-ending or world-transforming events don't have to be tragic or traumatic. You know, it could be a positive thing that ends one world and starts another. You know, you're a parent, so you know your world as a non-parent ended when you became a parent. Falling in love, winning the lottery, whatever it is. You know, an old world ends, the old world ends, and a new world begins. So I think that when the Book of Revelation uses the imagery and language about world-endingness, which it does, I think what it's trying to tell its readers is that if they understand its message, if they spend time with its prophetic images, they too can experience in their lives the end of the world as their old world is brought to an end, and they find themselves entering a new world in which Jesus Christ is known and experienced as the center of creation and as real in their lives by the Spirit of Christ, drawing all things and all people to himself. So that's kind of my no followed by a yes answer to your question.
Mm. Do you think people could be forgiven for thinking that it is directly about the end of the world because it just so happens to be the last book in the New Testament, and it just so happens to talk about the devil being chained up and a new heaven and a new earth? Do you think you could understand why people may go down that line?
Yeah, I can understand why people go down that line. I think the thing is, most people these days have not read much Jewish apocalyptic literature. So, you know, we tend not to. I mean, even Jewish people tend not to read a lot of Jewish apocalyptic literature, but it was a huge thing in the kind of couple of hundred years before the Book of Revelation was written. And I've got, on my bookshelves, which you can see behind me, I've got a couple of really big books there full of Jewish apocalyptic texts from the period before and after the Book of Revelation. And if you read those, you realize that this way of writing uses futuristic language to describe an alternative way of viewing the present. The best analogy I've got on this is science fiction, which is a contemporary genre. So, you know, if you're watching Star Trek or 2001: A Space Odyssey or something like that, and, you know, you don't watch that and think that's a literal prediction of what the world is going to be like in the future. And here we are, 20 years on from 2001, and we don't go, well, none of that happened. That was a load of rubbish then. When's 2001: A Space Odyssey going to be fulfilled? What we know is that there's a genre there that uses future set images and future language to explore issues relating to the present. And a lot of the themes that you get in science fiction are about the world we're living in now. They just use future language to explore them. So I think what we've got going on in Jewish apocalyptic is a very similar leap. I think it's an analogous genre. So they use language of going up to heaven and looking down on the earth and understanding, seeing the world differently because you're viewing it from on high, or they use language of let's go to a future and imagine a future, all really to explore what their present situation was like. And if you read those, then the book of Revelation sort of neatly fits into that way of thinking and that type of writing. What I think has happened is the book of Revelation is one of those texts that is really quite anti-imperial. It's really quite anti the Roman Empire. And a lot of its negative images, I think we may come on to this a bit later, but a lot of its negative images are negative images for Rome. So this is fine when you're a persecuted Christian sect and the Roman Empire is the big bad enemy. But if you fast forward 300 years to, Constantine and Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire, you've got this, frankly, highly embarrassing text there in your scriptures, which is an anti-empire text, just at the point where Christianity is wanting to make itself the empire's religion. So how do you deal with that? Well, you can't take it out of the Bible because it's in the canon of scripture by that point. So you have to find a way of interpreting it, which means it's not quite so awkward to read. So I think that as Christendom starts and as Christianity becomes the imperial religion, the anti-imperial language of the book of Revelation means the only way you can read it is to start saying, well, it's clearly written about the future. And at that point, of course, we've moved from a Jewish world into a Gentile world. So people are not so familiar with Jewish apocalypses and they don't know that this is one of those texts. So the easiest thing in the world is to read it as a prediction of the future. And that gets you out of the hole that you've got if you're the empire and Christianity seeking an alliance.
Mm. So really then, Revelation and this genre, Revelation is not the only book using this genre at the time.
Yeah, not at all. No, there's loads of them. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Simon. I want to move on to the next section, if that's okay. A lot of people in talking about the Antichrist, I've noticed point to two particular sections in the book. One is the White Horse Rider in chapter 6, and one is 666 in chapter 13. So my first question is, who do you believe the rider is on the White Horse in chapter 6?
Okay, I absolutely will answer that, but I'm just going to pick up the word Antichrist, if I may, very briefly as a way into that. So if you read through the book of Revelation, the word Antichrist isn't in there. So it's just worth saying that because people often assume it is. And one of my favorite little things to do with the class is to say, tell me where the Antichrist is in the book of Revelation. And of course, there's no reference. It's in the Johannine epistles. And in the Johannine epistles, the Antichrist there, it seems to be referring to an individual or a group of individuals within the congregation that those letters are written to, who are behaving in a way that is against Christ or anti-Christ. What's happened, of course, is in the Christian interpretative tradition, this idea that there will be some future anti-Christ figure has picked up on those words from the Johannine epistles, combined it with various other bits from various books, and you end up with this kind of whole there's going to be some future Antichrist who's going to come, how can we recognize them question. I kind of want to unpick that a bit and say that's not supported or sustained by reading the texts. I think you can see how people might have got there, but I think if you go back to the texts, that's not the obvious place to go. So then you end up saying, well, what is the rider on the white horse in chapter 6? And There's various ways of reading that. I mean, one of probably the dominant way of reading that is that this is one of the four riders. So the four living creatures at this point, who kind of represent the totality of creation. They're calling out, come, and out comes one rider on a white horse, and then another rider on another coloured horse, and so you end up with four horses. And this is the famous four horsemen of the apocalypse, of course, because the apocalypse is a word for the book of Revelation. And probably the most dominant way of reading these is that these four horses represent, and their riders represent, evil going out and about in the world, and the dominance of evil in the world, doing battle with the people of Christ and those who would seek to bear witness to Jesus. However, I'm not convinced that the first one is actually such a bad character as people have often thought. I think rather than being some kind of satanic parody of Christ, which is how it's often read, I think that the rider on the white horse is one of Revelation's images for Jesus. So we have a rider on a white horse actually in two different places in the book of Revelation. We've got in chapter 6, but then we've got also coming up again in chapter 19, where you also get a rider on a white horse. And really the key interpretive question here is whether these two are to be understood as the same person. Now, the second one in chapter 19 is unquestionably Christ. Is the first one? That's an interesting question. So Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, identified the rider on the white horse in chapter 6, verse 2 as Christ. And I'll just read the verse out here. It's a white horse, its rider had a bow, a crown given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. So, as I said, this is either a satanic parody of Christ, this is evil coming out to conquer Christians, or this is Christ coming out to conquer evil in the world. And if you look at the identical phrases used between chapter 6 and chapter 19, we get this phrase, and behold a white horse and he who sat on it, exactly the same construction used in both chapters. I think that you begin to get an idea that this first rider may actually be the first appearance of Jesus on his horse, which is then completed in the image towards the end of the book in chapter 19. So by this understanding, the bow in the rider's hand in chapter 6 parallels the rod of iron in Jesus's hand on his white horse in chapter 19. And they're kind of images of judgment. You've got this phrase, he's wearing a crown, which of course resonates with the crown worn by the one like a son of man in chapter 14, verse 14. So I think that this is actually Jesus representing Christ coming forth into the world to make war on the forces of evil, which are then represented by the next three riders. So the first one is Jesus and the next three are the forces of evil. So I think we could say more about that, but I'll kind of pause that there and see if you want to pick up on anything.
I'm sure you've come across these counter arguments, but what would you say to people who say, well, it can't be Jesus because he's the lamb in the throne room, or maybe the idea of conquering, people see that maybe as a negative imagery? Would you have maybe a response to that?
Yeah, I think that there's really no doubt at all that the rider in chapter 19 on a white horse who wins the battle of Armageddon with the sword that comes from his mouth, that's definitely Jesus. So the book of Revelation definitely uses a rider on a white horse tooled up to defeat the forces of evil as an image for Jesus. It also uses other images for Jesus, the lamb that was slain and is yet alive, the lion, there's a whole range of images that John uses for Jesus to convey different aspects of his theology about Jesus. But Jesus who conquers evil is definitely one of those images, and we've definitely got that in 19. What I'm suggesting is that the one in chapter 6 is the same image as 19, rather than a satanic parody of 19, which is how people who want to read it as a kind of an Antichrist or an evil figure would tend to read it.
Thank you, Simon. I'll move on to the second figure that seems to be very popular in Revelation. I've heard many times that 666 does refer to Emperor Nero. how concrete is that, do you think? Is it absolutely no shadow of a doubt it is Nero?
I'd go with 95%. I think is probably as definite as probably as definite as I'll get on anything in terms of interpreting the Bible. But yeah, I'll go with a high 90s figure. I mean, the 666 has been interpreted in a whole bunch of ways. I can remember when I was growing up, you know, I was being told that this would be some chip that would be implanted into my forehead and on my wrist, or I remember being shown how you can get 666 from barcodes, and you know, so I've seen all of that stuff. But within the world of the Book of Revelation, I think we need to realize that the character of Nero looms large over the whole book. I tend to date Revelation relatively early. I know a lot of people date it to kind of about 95 under the Emperor Domitian. I actually think it's much earlier text than that. I put it at about 71. And of course, Nero was this emperor who had, through the 60s, enacted horrific persecutions. Not just against Christians. I mean, he was pretty paranoid, you know, he tried to persecute the fire service at one point. So, you know, we don't want to think Nero just persecuted Christians, but he did horrifically persecute Christians. And, you know, this idea of Christians being, you know, tied up and covered in tar and set on fire to light the Lamian gardens at night, and, you know, all of that really awful stuff that Nero did is kind of part of the background to the Book of Revelation. So, I don't think it's just in the 666 image that you find Nero. I think you find Nero looming behind a lot of the images. I think he's like behind the purple beast and so on, with the myth that arose that Nero wasn't really dead, or if he was dead, he was going to come back to life and take the Roman Empire over again. That was all kind of there at the time. And I think that finds its way into John's images. So when we get to 666, I think we're in the world of Jewish numerology here. I don't know if you've ever done that thing where you've done A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and you've kind of written your name as numbers. Mm-hmm. But the Jews believed that the number you could derive from someone's name, if it was a special number, you know, one of their mystical numbers, that could tell you something important about the person, or could function as a code for the person. Interestingly, if you've got an old-fashioned phone, I mean, you know, here's my iPhone. Do you remember they used to get 1, 2, 3 on ABC, sorry, on number 1, and 2, 3, 4 on number 2, and so on. And you could, in old-fashioned predictive text, you could type it in. Well, M, O, and N all come on the number 6. And so if you type Simon, you type 54666. So you could say 666 is one of the numbers in my name. I'm not going to make too much of that, but it's an interesting analogy to make. So I think when we've got Revelation, it says that, you know, that the beast has a name, and the name is a mystery, and the name is a number. This is in chapter 13, and then the number is given as 666. It seems to me that the author here has an individual in mind, that they've got someone who they're wanting to point the finger to here, and they're doing it using Jewish numerology. And they're like, if you can work out this number, you'll know what I'm talking about. And it's very simple, really. If you take the Greek for Nero Caesar, and if you transliterate it into Hebrew and turn it into a number, you get 666. It's that straightforward. But 666 is also the number you get when you do the same process to the Greek word for beast, which is therion. So I kind of picture John as a kind of first century fan of the cryptic crossword here. You know, he's sitting there on Patmos wanting to write this unmasking of the empire for the people in his churches, and wants to find a way of saying Nero is the beast. I'm just imagining him getting really excited that if you do numerology on Nero Caesar in Greek, and you do exactly the same numerology on the word beast, they both come out as 666. There is an interesting manuscript variation. In some of the early manuscripts, the number is 616. And interestingly with that, if you do exactly the same from the Latin rather than from the Greek, you lose the N at the end of Nero, and that's worth 50, and you end up with 616. So I think it's pointing quite convincingly that he's got in mind here that this is Nero, and then that somebody wanting to make that same point in a Latin manuscript ends up making it work for the Latin. There is another significance with 666, which is that it's the Jewish number of perfection was 7. So it's 3 times short of 7. And it may just be that there's also something in there that Nero, this beast, is also kind of eternally short of perfection. I think the interesting thing to go from this, though, is what do you do with the fact that John appears to be pointing to an individual and identifying them? Some people down the centuries have sought to kind of update this, and there's whole lists of people who have been identified as the beast. Several popes have been identified as the beast, but you could go on and find many others as well. I think it's really, it's potentially very dangerous to kind of want to necessarily point at people in our world as being such a personification of evil that they need to be identified as a beast. But I can think of some. I went to Cambodia a couple of years ago, and I went and saw the killing fields, and I saw what Pol Pot did to children in those killing fields. It's horrific. And you might think of Hitler, the classic European example. I do think that sometimes there are individuals who so personify evil in the world, they so give themselves over to works of evil, that we might want to join John in saying, in our age, that is an evil that must be opposed. But I would be cautious about doing that, and I certainly wouldn't want it to be a kind of political point scoring tool to use against political leaders we might disagree with, or religious leaders we might disagree with. But I think that process of naming individuals who personify evil is something to ponder in terms of how we preach this text and how we reflect on it, how it applies to our world.
Would you say, just 2 questions to follow up on that?
Yeah, sure.
Would you say people who hold to the futuristic reading of Revelation, the only way to get around that is that they say 666 doesn't refer to Nero specifically, but it just sort of represents a Nero type figure? Would you say they have a strong argument for that, or is that basically a way of avoiding the evidence that seems to suggest that very strongly that it is Nero?
I don't know why people want to avoid it being Nero in the first place. I mean, I tend to think futuristic prediction-based readings of Revelation are wrong anyway. I think they're missing the point of the text. So I disagree with them on a whole range of things, of which this is merely one. But even if you're going to take that view, I don't see what's wrong with it being a reference to Nero in the 1st century, because there may be other Neros. I mean, there's this great image in Revelation that the beast has its head cut off and then grows another one. If the beast is the forces of empire, which the idolatrous forces that humans construct into power that oppose Christ, the Roman Empire may be dead and gone, but other empires arise and then they go away and then other empires arise. Humans have this idolatrous tendency to build empires of power that oppose the reign of Christ. And we do it in any age, we do it in our age. You can look through history and see that. And I think sometimes an individual so gives themselves over to that work of evil that they might need calling out individually. And I think that's what this image gives us permission to do. But I'd be wanting really, really careful about that. But I certainly don't think Revelation has no relevance to the contemporary world. I want to look around me and see where are evil powers that need to be opposed in the name of Christ. But that doesn't mean I think Revelation specifically predicted them, or that it means the world's about to end. I just think it means Revelation speaks to my world as the rest of the Bible does.
And the second question, if this is okay, I'm going to read from Ian Boxall. I believe you have the same book behind you there.
I do.
He quotes, he says that 616, so the copy that was found in Egypt, I think you said, could also refer to Gaius, which is Caligula. What would you say to that there could be another Roman emperor at the scene here? I know 666 is the original.
I mean, it's Richard Borkham who suggests that it might be another way of understanding Nero. I mean, Ian Boxall he knows more about this stuff than I do, so I will bow to him on that. I think it's Richard Borkham who suggests that 616 predominantly should be understood as referring to Nero, but I mean, Ian Boxall really knows his stuff, and I don't know enough to contradict him, so I'm quite happy to sort of take that as another suggestion that might explain that divergent manuscript tradition.
I suppose it's interesting that they both do point to Roman emperors, don't they? No matter which way you read it, that's quite interesting.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's Nero or not in terms of the divergent tradition, it's still grounding the primary audience for this text within the first century. And then, our task is how do we interpret that and apply it, rather than reading it as something which predicting something that's going to happen in the 21st century as a direct prediction.
Thank you, Simon. The next one I want to ask, and this is to do with the millennium, the 1,000 years. I suppose I could ask you a personal question first, which would be, are you post, pre, or amillennialist?
I'm actually going to say none of the above, because I think they are answers to the wrong question. That's the problem. I think if your question is, when is the millennium going to happen, then pre, post, and amillennial are answers to that, really. I mean, even amillennialism still sees it as outworking itself in Christian history. It's just seeing it differently. I think that they're asking the text to do something it's not meant to do, which is one of the reasons why there's no, nobody wins the argument on that one, because the text doesn't actually answer it. So I'm going to reject all of those. I don't have a name for what I am, but we can talk a little bit about what I think that image is for in the book. So in terms, I mean, the word millennium is one of those catchwords that's acquired something of a life on its own, that's taken it far beyond the pages of the book where it started. So it means 1,000, so that's where the word comes from. But it's kind of come to mean in contemporary culture some kind of dawning 1,000-year golden age. So, in New Age, you get the Age of Aquarius. The Third Reich of Nazi Germany was going to be last 1,000 years. So, it's kind of entered into the popular, particularly European mindset around images of a new dawning golden age in whatever era it is people happen to be proclaiming it. And, as you said, for some Christians, this has become really the key to understanding the whole book of Revelation. And there are these endless discussions about whether Jesus is going to return to the earth before, pre, or after, post the millennium. But within the book of Revelation, I think the 1,000 years has a much more pastoral function. So as I said earlier, Revelation is written to those who have faced dreadful persecution. They have heard stories or even personally witnessed Christians being executed for their faith. And the thing is, from an earthly perspective, the death of the believer through martyrdom appears to have been the ultimate victory for the satanic beast of empire. There's kind of nothing worse that the beast can do to Christians than to put them to death. But John is always, through the book of Revelation, trying to offer his readers heaven's perspective on their earthly situation. And I think he wants them to realize that from heaven's perspective, martyrdom is actually not the defeat that it might appear to be. It's a victory. And so he describes those who have been martyred for their testimony to Jesus as reigning with Christ for 1,000 years, for the millennium. And if you can kind of imagine reading it from the point of view of those who are receiving it, those who may have had loved ones killed by Nero, or who may fear that they're going to face martyrdom themselves, this can be an image of great comfort. It assures those reading it that when seen from above, when seen from heaven's perspective, the martyrdom of the faithful believer is the precise opposite of what it appears to be when seen from below. It's victory, it's not defeat. So the contrast here is between the reign of Christ and the reign of an emperor. An emperor might reign for a decade or two at best, but Christ reigns with all the martyrs with him in this image for 1,000 years. And so I think what we've got here is a really powerful pastoral metaphor to assure Christians that martyrdom is their participation in the victorious eternal will and outworking of God's will on the earth, rather than just the end at the hands of the beast of empire. So I read it as a pastoral metaphor.
would you say then, Simon, it's fair to say that the millennium, this millennium passage, should almost be separated from the doctrine of the second coming? Is this a
Yes.
completely different
Yes.
thing?
I do think that, yeah. I think what we've got going on here is at the end of the millennium, Satan is released for a little while from the pit. So within chapter 20, Satan is bound, cast into the pit. Then you've got the 1,000-year reign of the saints with Christ. And then at the end of it, Satan is let out for a little while and makes war against the camp of the saints. So it's clearly not the end of all things, this millennium. It's an inserted image into the scheme. And I think if John wants his readers to imagine themselves somewhere in this text, it's in that little period where Satan has been let out again, but has not yet been finally defeated. And I think that's where we can locate ourselves in this text. So you've got the martyrdom of Jesus. You know, he's kind of the first of the Christian martyrs. He's resurrected, but he dies at the hands of the empire. So all of those other martyrs who die are united with Christ in his death, as they will be united with Christ in his resurrection, but they're united with him in death. So you've got this image of the martyrs and the martyred Christ, not dead, but reigning. And then, and the defeat of Satan at that point is assured. You know, his number is up, but he's not yet finished. And then he's released for a little while to make war on the saints. And that's where we live. We live in this period of time between times. You can think of it over like the Easter weekend. You know, you've got Good Friday when Jesus dies. Then you've got Holy Saturday, which is just this period of waiting. And then you've got the glory of the final resurrection on Easter Sunday. And I think you can kind of print that onto this bit at the beginning of chapter 20. You've got the death of the martyrs and the death of Christ. Then you've got this period that correlates with Easter Saturday, when Satan is once again seeking to bring darkness and despair and sin into the world, making war with the saints before he is finally defeated and the resurrection is completed. So I think that's kind of the theological scheme, but I read it theologically. I don't read it as a prediction of something that's going to be worked out in kind of measurable human history. I think it's worked out in my life and your life and all of our lives, you know, that I think it helps with human experience and helps people understand in that way.
Thanks, Simon. And so the next question I wanted to ask you, why do you think the futuristic reading of Revelation and this predicting a sequence of events is so popular? And is it perhaps more popular than a first century reading? Why is it so attractive, do you think?
I think everybody loves, I don't want to be disparaging it, but kind of, it's a great story, isn't it? You know, this, I mean, I've read Left Behind, and I've read the books that Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, and, you know, the idea that we might be the last generation, that the prophecies are being fulfilled before our eyes, that it's all about to happen. I mean, you know, that's a very attractive proposition. And I can really see its attraction. You know, if I really believed that, that would be amazing. I don't, but I read it in other ways, which I think can be equally amazing if it's a little bit less dramatic. But I think it holds a powerful, it plays to our desire to be significant in history. And the fact that this might be happening in my time is a very attractive thing. And, you know, we're not the first generation to have done this. I did a whole ton of research at one point on 17th century Baptist millennialists. You know, you go back to the 1600s, there were Baptists who believed that the execution of the king, the Catholic king, and the installation of Cromwell, who was friendly towards the Puritans and the dissenters, that was the beginning of the millennial reign. So, you know, there have been people in all the way through human history. You can rewind to Joachim of Fiore in the, I think, 11th century. You know, he thought it was all happening in his time and that the millennial reign was just about to begin. You know, it's a very compelling thing, the idea that I might be one of those people who lives at the turn of human history. It's a little bit more ordinary to think I'm going to get my 70 or 80 years and then I step off and it's somebody else's turn and I make the difference I make and then I'm gone. much better to be the end of the world now. I just don't think that's what this text is doing.
Yes, thank you, Simon. I'm going to ask a very strange, blunt question now, if this is okay, and it may seem very strange. Is there such a thing as the second coming?
I'm going to give you another one of my no and yes answers. If what we're talking about is some decisive point in human history when Jesus descends on a cloud to the Mount of Olives, and all those people who are alive at that point see that happen in some way, and there's a lot of thought that the digital age might be what allows that to happen. I've heard all of that stuff. No, I don't believe that. Okay, I don't think that the second coming of Jesus is something that's going to happen either in my lifetime in that way or at any point in the future. And I don't think that's really what these texts are trying to predict. I think what they're trying to say is that Jesus, who was died and has been raised and is with God, comes again and again and again to the earth. So I would say that, yes, I have experienced in my life the second coming of Jesus, as have you in yours. He comes to us in, not in physical form. That was the first coming. The second coming is he comes by his Spirit, transforming our lives and through us transforming the world. So I do believe in it, but I kind of interpret it slightly differently. I take a non-futuristic view. I think it's fulfilled in the coming of Jesus to his followers by his Spirit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon. I believe that is all my questions.
It's been a delight. It really has, and it's been so good to be part of this. And I look forward to seeing the program. I understand you've got some other people teed up, which is going to be very exciting.
Yes. Hopefully, I would say, hopefully a month or two with editing and all that. All that good stuff. We will have completion. But thank you so much, Simon. Thank you for your time. This has been
That's all right, mate. Sorry about the edit bit in the beginning where my wife just came in to make a cup of tea. I had to say, not right now. All right, it's great to see you. I'll let you get on, but let's keep in touch.
Will do, and I'll message you with any progress and
great.
And maybe if you know of any scholars yourself who may be able to help me, that'd be cool.
Okay, I'll give it some thought. But so if you've got Ian Boxall, you're home and dry, mate.
Thank you so much, Simon. Have a great day.